Welcome back, my friend. My name is Victor Nieves. Of course, this is the Victor Nieves Show. I want to personally welcome you back to the program wherever you may be listening, whether that's on radio, podcast, or over even on YouTube. These days, we do have it on YouTube. We have a lot to talk about. Today's episode is going to really be centered primarily on judicial activism. Because what we've seen over the last week, I think that this conversation is due. We have seen judges that are stepping into roles that they were never meant to step into. So we're going to talk about that a little bit. We'll even get into the Supremacy Clause. We'll get into the Federalist Papers. We'll get into it all, so you don't want to miss that. We'll also be touching on some other things that are very topical. A lot of stuff has been going on. The IRS could be deputized to help with ICE and deportation. Pam Bondi is going after these people as Attorney General. You'll love to see all of it. But before we do that, before we jump into the meat and taters, as always, I want to start off the show the very best way that I know how. That's by doing my best to bring glory and honor to my Lord and Savior Jesus Christ, because I have been blessed beyond measure. I have been blessed beyond reason. And listen, I didn't earn those blessings. I don't deserve those blessings. But as I always say, I am tremendously, tremendously grateful for those blessings. And if you listen to me on one singular issue, I hope and I sincerely pray that you will accept Jesus Christ as your personal Lord and Savior. Now, with that said, let's jump into this. And there's so many different ways that we could tackle the topic of judicial activism. The first and most important, I think, is to lay a bedrock, a foundation in the Constitution. And I know the public school has failed the vast majority of us, and it's been a really long time, probably, since last you looked at the Constitution. Or at least this would be true of most people. Maybe you, as one of my viewers or listeners, maybe, you're really into the Constitution and you know this like the back of your hand. But the Constitution in Article 1, 2, and 3, respectively, lays out the different powers that belong to the different branches. So Article 1 talks obviously about Congress. Article 2 talks about the administrative office, the president. And then Article 3 talks about the role of the courts. And this is a topic, you could do so much research on this. You could go back to Marbury Madison in the early 1800s. You could study the Federalist Papers. You could study the original debate that happened early on in our nation's history. But what's curious about Article 3, and if you read it, you'll see this with your own eyes, there's not a lot. Article 3, in fact, is kind of extraordinarily vague, is what I would say. If you look, for example, to Article 1, and you read through the powers that are very specifically enumerated, they're given to Congress under no uncertain terms, right? We see very clearly what is the role of Congress. Here are the enumerated powers, the list of things that the United States Congress can do. Similarly, but not quite as explicit, I suppose, in Article 2, we have the powers of the president. We have what is his role, the administrative branch. And there was a debate. Some of our founding fathers wanted a very powerful executive, something that would truthfully closely, mirror a monarch. Obviously, that's not what we have. And so there was a great compromise that happened even in that role. Even in the role of the president, some people wanted it to be like a lifetime thing. You get elected president one time, and there you go. And looking back, we might say, well, that's crazy. Why would you ever want a president to be elected one time and then never have to have re-election? Well, there's pros and cons to it, and these were very intelligent people. Sometimes folks on the left, they'll try and act like the founding fathers were all just a bunch of young idiots. This is not true. I mean, you had people like Benjamin Franklin. You had people, many of them were in their 30s, their 40s. You had experienced people who were incredibly well-educated, incredibly well-versed in philosophy and politics and the Enlightenment era and Christianity and the principles of all of it. These guys, I would dare say, had IQs that would blow any of us out of the water. These were not stupid or uneducated men that were making these decisions and having these debates. The issue, by the way, to play a little bit of devil's advocate for why it would be good to have a president that more closely mirrored a monarch, and listen, this isn't my position, but I do understand why they would make such a position. There's a lot of turnover. There's a lot of uncertainty, especially just looking at our foreign policy. It changes every 4 years. At the very minimum, it changes every 8 years. When we have a re-election or a new president steps into office, foreign policy changes a lot. Whereas you look at some of these other countries, it can be very stable for 20, 30, 40, 50 years, as long as you have, the head executive in that position. But anyways, getting back to Articles 1, 2, and 3, you see the different powers laid out to the different branches. And I would encourage people to do this. It doesn't take a ton of reading to go through Articles 1, 2, and 3. And if you don't see This is always a fun experiment. The public school really failed in this regard. If you go into Article 1 and you read the enumerated powers of Congress, and then you look at what Congress is doing, and you don't see the authority to do that in the Constitution, one of their enumerated powers, then it's not theirs to do. If they don't have that authority given to them, then it's not their authority. We have to remember, by the way, going way back, before we were the United States of America, we were independent largely states. We weren't a nation per se, we were states, where you were a citizen of your state. And so to get all of these states on board, obviously, there was a lot of very high-level negotiation that had to happen, and a lot was going on. Well, the states came together and they said, sure. After the failed Articles of Confederation, they said, sure, we'll create a federal government with a federal system, right, where we have state, local, federal government, and we're only going to give that federal government just a handful of powers. Everything else is delegated to the states, and we see that, of course, played out, made very clear in the 10th Amendment, all powers that are not specifically given to Congress in Article 1 or prohibited specifically from the states or reserved for the states and the people respectively. But anyways, I digress. It's a very interesting thing, right? You look at what Congress is doing and then you see, do they have the authority to do it? More often than not, the answer to that question is going to be no. But anyways, when we look at Article 3, the powers of the judiciary, a lot of people these days seem to think that the courts, at any level, especially true of the Supreme Court, but at any level, they seem to think that the court is just the end-all be-all. The court is the supreme arbiter. I mean, even at the Supreme Court, you have supreme in the name, and so some people have really kind of fallen for this hook, line, and sinker. And you're taught in school, even the Schoolhouse Rock stuff, is that it's the role of the judges to determine what is constitutional, and that's, funny enough, nowhere to be seen in Article 3 of the United States Constitution. Now, we have Supreme Court precedent with this, Judicial Review, Marbury versus Madison. We have a whole, I've actually done programs on this. We have entire episodes dedicated to Marbury, Madison, and dedicated to Judicial Review and the Jeffersonian alternative, which would have been states' rights nullification. But anyways, we're getting too deep here. The reason I lay this all out is because we need a foundation. So when we see the courts step in, at any level, it becomes a little bit more interesting at the highest level, a little bit, more precarious maybe at the lower levels. When we see an individual federal judge, or we see any court at any level, stepping in and trying to take power from the president, power that is specifically his, right? The administrative branch is his. Now, he can't go and tell the courts what to do. He can't go and tell Congress what to do. He can try, but they don't have to listen to him. But his power is over the administrative branch. And so there are certain things that fall well within the legitimate purview of the President of the United States. And that's been upheld for the longest time. The courts haven't stepped in the way of that. Nobody has stepped in the way of that until Donald Trump becomes president. Then all of a sudden, every judge is suddenly what? A member of Congress? Every judge thinks that he's a robed king? Is that the system of government that was laid out by our founding fathers? No. If you read Article 3, you won't find anything in there that says that a judge can order the President of the United States to, for example, reinstate certain language on an administrative website, like talking about certain government websites directly under the purview of the President of the United States, that he himself, he has the final authority in managing them. He takes off gender ideology language, and you have a judge step in and say, no, you have to reinstate it. Absolutely not. That is a judge trying to step in and execute, an Article 3 judge trying to execute powers in Article 2. We have separation of powers in our Constitution for a darn good reason. We do not hand over the authority to make those kinds of decisions to robed tyrants. We don't hand it over to the Supreme Court, we don't hand it over to any lower court, and we certainly don't give it to some random federal judge who has some vendetta against Donald Trump. And what you'll find with all of these, there's been too many to keep track of. The last week has been judicial warfare. What you'll see is these are people who are appointed by the political opponents of Donald Trump, and they're entrenched in the swamp. These are the very creatures, the very monsters that we have sworn that we have to destroy. And of course, it's mutual. They've sworn to destroy us. And so they're going after us like crazy. Specifically, of course, they're going after Donald Trump like crazy. They want to stop all of his goals. They want to reject the mandate that was given to him by the American people with a commanding electoral college win and a popular vote win. They're stepping outside of the boundaries of the Constitution. They're violating the separations of powers. And they're trying to tell the President of the United States, Donald Trump, no, you cannot do that. In fact, here's what we're going to compel you to do. We're going to tell you how you run the administrative branch. Absolutely not. In no way, shape, or form is that the way that things are supposed to work. And this conversation kind of demands that we have a broader conversation about the Supremacy Clause, about the structure, the correct relationship between those branches of government. But what I can tell you beyond the shadow of a doubt is that these judges trying to step in are operating way outside of the Constitution of the United States. So as we talk about the issue of judicial activism, what we've seen happening to Donald Trump, obviously they're operating outside of what their power is. What then is the response? What is the correct answer from President Donald Trump when he has a rogue judge, which is what this is, trying to become, an almighty legislator? What does he do? Well, I would advise President Trump, obviously, I doubt that he listens to the program, but hey, maybe he does. Maybe some of his people do. I would advise them to, at the very least, reference Federalist 78. Hamilton writes in Federalist 78 extensively about the courts. And so to take another trip down memory lane into history, the reason that you have the Federalist Papers is because in order to get the Constitution ratified, this is a huge leap, again, going from the Articles of Confederation to a republic, to the system of government that we now have, the new constitutional republic that we have, was a huge shift. And it went away from this much more decentralized authority toward a much more centralized federal government. And so the people at the time of the ratification of the Constitution, rightfully so, they had quite a few concerns. They had hesitations, and they weren't quite sure that they wanted to sign up to this because, again, they had just broken off from one tyrant, 1,000 miles away. Why would they want to have another tyrant 50 miles away, trading one bad for another? And so the Federalist Papers were written in many ways to explain the Constitution very, very clearly because, and real quick, have to go down a tangent here, the Constitution was meant to be explained and understood, I should say, by every single American. There is this attitude these days by pundits on talk news, by, cable hosts, and especially by liberal attorneys, that you as a layperson aren't possibly capable of understanding the Constitution. No, you have to have somebody far more intelligent, far more qualified, far more important than you are. Because again, you're just a stupid layperson. You have to have some liberal attorney come in and explain to you your rights because you're not smart enough to figure that one out. It's almost kind of similar. There's some parallels to Animal Farm. It's like you don't know how to read, so you have to have somebody else explain these rights to you and explain what all of it is. You can't possibly figure out the Constitution. No, absolutely not. I spit in the face of that idiotic nonsense. To claim that the average American is not capable of understanding the Constitution is to undermine the entire structure of government that we have. I mean, the responsibility of maintaining our republic falls on the people, not the judges. Anyways, the whole point of the Federalist Papers was to convince people, the average American, that ratification was in fact a good idea and that we weren't going to create a tyrannical form of government. And Federalist 78, Hamilton again writing, specifically mentions the court because human nature never changes. The people back in the 1700s, 1790s, they were very smart. They were very intelligent. They had studied Rome. They had studied ancient, antiquity, and they had figured out certain patterns that repeat and the reasons that self-representation has failed. And so one of the issues that has, like a whack-a-mole, continued to pop up throughout human history is that the courts become politicized, or the courts become corrupt, or the courts start to wield their power in a way that nobody believed that they were supposed to be able to wield it. And so in Federalist 78, Hamilton specifically says that the Supreme Court, the third branch of government, being the courts and, the Supreme Court and all of the inferior courts, would be the weakest. Does that seem to be the way that we handle things now? Does that seem to be the way that your public school education represented our system of government? Did they tell you that the courts were meant to be the weakest of the three branches? Because that's what Hamilton said as he tried to convince the nation for ratification. That was kind of the deal that was laid out to the American people was, hey, listen, I know you have your concerns, but let me make the case as to why you shouldn't be concerned about this system as we have written it, as we have structured it. You shouldn't be concerned about the courts because, as he says, it lacks any power to enforce its decision. He also mentioned how it has neither the power of the pen, the purse, or the sword. And so the Supreme Court cannot declare war. The Supreme Court doesn't have the army, whereas the president, is the commander in chief, and Congress declares war. And so it's interesting that he would say that. They also don't have the power of the budget. They can't even allocate funds. So the court is kind of an empty vessel in a certain way. And there have been these constitutional crises in the past where the court tries to do something, but they don't actually have an enforcement mechanism. The court cannot make you do anything. They make a decision and then they essentially pass it on, funny enough, to the administrative branch. And they say, hey, will you enforce this? Well, a very famous quote by Andrew Jackson is, that's a lovely decision, now enforce it. My recommendation to the Trump administration would quite literally be, now you have to, this is something you have to be don't go too far about this. Otherwise, pitchforks come out and it's a whole nother conversation. That's why we have the Second Amendment. But ignore them. If the court wants to come out and step into the legitimate purview of the president of the United States, the president should simply ignore them. In the same way that if the president all of a sudden tried to snatch the powers of Congress, right? If he went into Article 1, Section 8, I believe it is, and started reading off the powers of Congress and said, no, I think I want to be the one to make all of these decisions. I think I want to be the one to pass these things. I think I want to, it starts gobbling up their power. Maybe he goes to Article 3 and he starts trying to take the powers of the court. Well, the whole entire idea here with separation of powers was that there was to be a jealous guarding of those powers, because human nature naturally, it says that we want to guard what is ours. We want possession of what powers we have been given. Very, very rarely do people who are in charge give up power. Why would they do that? It's kind of antithetical toward their innate desire. They always want more power. They don't want less power. And so the whole idea with separation of powers is that if one branch tried to step out and take powers that were not its, the other ones would fight back. The other ones would say, no, as a matter of fact, sweetheart, I'm not going to be listening to you. So in this case, absolutely, Donald Trump should look at those judges and he should say, wow, I had never thought of it that way. Yeah, it's a really lovely decision, Judge. Now enforce it. Figure out how you, Judge, are going to make me change the website that I have and include this stupid language about LGBTQ. It's a lovely decision. How are you going to make that one play out? And the answer is, of course, that the court really can't. There's really nothing that the Supreme Court can do, which again, in Federalist 78, it is supposed to be that way. That was the entire promise that was made to the American people during the ratification of the Constitution. It was that the court was to be the weakest. And listen, I hate to see that this is where it is. And some people may say, well, Victor, isn't that forcing a bit more of a constitutional crisis? Isn't that stepping it up, kind of escalating the situation to where now you have open defiance, where the president of the United States is openly defying, judges and federal courts and things of that nature? Sure. And if you want to look at it that way, I suppose you could say that that is, from a certain perspective, true. I think a more accurate way to frame it, a more accurate way to represent what has happened here, is not that the president is acting in some sort of defiance of the courts, but that the court is acting in defiance of the Constitution. The court in no way has the power to do this. So if you really look at who is the original offender wouldn't be the president of the United States, in the same way that if the president tried to take, the role of Congress and confiscate powers of Congress, and Congress said no, who would be the original offender? It would be the president. It doesn't matter which branch is trying to take over the powers of the other branches. It's the duty, I would say, of the branch that's being violated to say no. No, absolutely not. I will jealously protect what the American people have given to me. This is my role. These are my responsibilities. You don't get to take them from me. Now, before we move on from this topic of the judges and Article 3 and all of this, I mentioned earlier the Supremacy Clause, and I want to get to that because we laid that foundation, Article 1, 2, and 3, we looked at their different respective powers and all of that. And what the public school system has oftentimes done is they have totally misrepresented so much of the Supremacy Clause, and they've done it. There's layers to the way that they've done this. First and foremost, I want to approach it from what I believe to be probably the most constitutionally significant angle, and that is that you have been lied to, for one, in the fact that it's even the Supremacy Clause. It's just a name that we added to it. What we're talking about is Article 6, Section 2. So if you ever want to go and read into this, look it up for yourself. I highly encourage you to do it. Don't ever take my word for anything in the Constitution. I will always give you, the source material. I'll tell you Article 1, Article 2, Article 3. In this case, this is Article 6, Section 2 of the United States Constitution. We see what has been dubbed, in many cases by the public education system, as the so-called Supremacy Clause, and that's been basically incorrectly labeled as the part of the Constitution that says any law of Congress supersedes any law of a state, which is to say that the federal government in every decision is supreme and overrules the states. And many people just accept that. They swallow it. They never think twice about it. They never question this idea. But of course, that doesn't make any sense. If you go back to, again, the foundation of this nation, the Federalist Papers, you go back to the Articles of Confederation and the individual states that existed prior to that, why on earth would the states have ever entered into that agreement? We see in Article 1 the specific powers of Congress. If Congress was just going to be given this blanket power to always override the states, what's the point in the 10th Amendment? What's the point in Article 1, Section 8, the enumerated powers of Congress? Why would we have that? The answer, of course, is that we would not. See, the federal government was not intended to be supreme to the states. The states created the federal government. The proper relationship is that the federal government ought to be often asking itself, will the states allow us to do that? Not the other way around, except it's been completely flipped on its head. It's been totally polarized here, where instead, the predominant view of our federal system of government is that we in the states will often look to the federal government and will ask the question, will the feds allow us, the states, to do that? When again, it should be the exact opposite. It should be the federal government asking if the states, which again created the Fed, will the states allow us to do that? That should be the perspective of Congress. It should be the perspective of the federal government in every capacity, is the question of whether or not the very states that created us are going to allow us to continue to do this. So of course, that is an incorrect, at face value, that's an incorrect understanding of history. It's an incorrect understanding of Article 6, Section 2. The so-called Supremacy Clause does not mean that the federal government is always supreme in everything that they ever do over the states. What it does mean, correctly understood, and this is not my opinion, but the opinion of the people who wrote it, what Article 6, Section 2, correctly understood, does say is that when it pertains to, because again, this is the same document, the Constitution, right? Earlier in the document, when it pertains to the specific enumerated powers, for example, of Congress, Congress is given certain authorities, the authority to coin money, the authority to have, like raise a navy, raise an army, call out the militia to repel foreign invasion, certain things like that, making treaties and things of that nature are specifically given to the federal government because it makes sense. I mean, you wouldn't want all of the individual states to be coining their own money. That was one of the problems in the Articles of Confederation. That was a problem, during the Revolutionary War. That was a problem that had plagued us. And so, of course, the states all got together and they agreed, okay, it's for the better that we hand this power over to a federal system or a federal government, and they're going to handle treaties. We don't want each state to have conflicting treaties with different foreign powers and all of that. So it makes perfect sense the way that the Founding Fathers created it. So this so-called Supremacy Clause, which again is a made-up name for a section of the Constitution, is really talking about, because it says in pursuance thereof. If you read the actual language of Article 6, Section 2, it talks about laws of Congress, treaties, and things of that nature that are passed in pursuance of the Constitution. That means in alignment with. So if it's aligned with the Constitution, again, Article 1, Section 8, the enumerated powers, then that would be an area where the federal government would, of course, be supreme. But then we also, to really put the nail into the coffin for the so-called Supremacy Clause believers, you have the 10th Amendment. The very existence of the 10th Amendment in our Bill of Rights specifically says, again, as I said before, that all powers not specifically given to the federal government or prohibited from the states, again, that would be things like entering into foreign military treaties with other nations, prohibited from the states, those are reserved. Every power not given to the federal government specifically or specifically reserved, taken away from the states. Those are powers reserved for the states and the people, respectively, meaning that the state government should be far supreme on the vast majority of issues, the things that actually impact your life. The role of the federal government ought to be incredibly, incredibly small. Now, state governments have a much less limited scope. State governments can do way more things because they're more directly accountable to the people. It's not some weirdo in Washington, D.C. making decisions that are impacting your life. It should be the guy, the representative that's your representative, who lives in your city, who shops at the same stores as you, whose kids go to the same schools as your kids. That's the way this is supposed to happen. This is the structure, the balance in a federal system of government like the one that we live in. That's how it is supposed to be. But of course, the federal government, with the Department of Education overseeing the education of millions of children, has decided that those children don't need to learn about the foundational principles that would cause those children to put the government on notice and check them. Why would the government teach you the very tools that you need to oppose them? Wouldn't make any sense, okay? And so anyways, that's the biggest issue with this whole supremacy setup. But now that we've addressed that, and that's something I could talk about ad nauseum, like literally forever. Now that we've addressed that situation, I do want to bring it back to the judges, to the courts, and this kind of thing. What you'll notice in Article 6, Section 2, is that at no point does it say decisions of judges. It doesn't say decisions of the United States Supreme Court. It doesn't say anything of that nature. It'll say, again, as you read it, you'll see laws of Congress passed in pursuance of the Constitution, federal treaties, that sorts of thing. They always have to align with the Constitution. Anything done outside of that is obviously not the supreme law of the land. But there's a very important omission that was made by the Founding Fathers. They did not say that the United States Supreme Court, despite the fact that it has the word in its name, the United States Supreme Court is not supreme. It's not the grandpa. It's not the dad. It's not the patriarch of the family that is our country. That's not the way that this is supposed to work. If the court is somehow supreme, this is the most important question. I think it's the easiest way to really drive home the point that I'm making, the same point that would have been made by Jefferson, the same point that really was made by Jefferson, by the way. If the Supreme Court is supreme, it begs the question, what even is the Constitution? Is the Constitution what it says? Or is the Constitution nothing more than a napkin, something to be molded and folded and twisted around by a couple of unelected robed tyrants? Because if the United States Supreme Court is actually supreme and they get to decide what the Constitution is, then say, if that is true, let's take it out to the extreme here. If the United States Supreme Court was to make a decision, for example, on, let's take the First Amendment, and they were to make a ruling that said, actually, you don't have the right to petition your government. If they were to take something that the Constitution very clearly says, a very black and white issue, and they were to say, no, actually, it's our decision as the United States Supreme Court, that doesn't actually mean what it says it means. We've come to an alternative understanding of it, and rather than meaning that you can actually petition your government, it means, and then they just insert their own reason. If the United States Supreme Court is supreme and we just have to yield to whatever they say, what are you doing in that situation? What do you do? Has the Constitution just changed because the opinion of a couple of unelected tyrants have waved their gavel around and all of a sudden they've changed the Constitution? How about if it pertained to the Second Amendment, shall not be infringed, and they were to, for example, uphold grotesquely unconstitutional restrictions on the Second Amendment? Has the Constitution now changed? There was no amendment made. I mean, we have a system. Article 5 lays out the amendment process to the United States Constitution. It's been done, 27 times? We've done it, but the courts don't have that. Article, am I missing something? Do I need to pull out my pocket Constitution? Does Article 5 say something I didn't see in real small print about how the courts can change the Constitution? No, of course that's not how that's not how it was structured. And I guess I can't end this conversation, by the way, without at least dabbling a tiny bit, without dipping my toes into the water of the topic of nullification, because you might be begging the question, okay, well then if we're not going to yield to the Supreme Court entirely, right, if we're going to have some level of reservation, what then is the alternative? If the court is to begin to, behave well outside of it, again, I already laid out in Federalist 78 that they have no actual power of their own. So again, it's a lovely decision. now try to enforce it. We can just simply ignore them. That is an actual option. But the option of ignoring it can come in the form of nullification from the states. And this isn't just nullification of the bench, this is nullification of Congress as well. It's a nullification of laws signed by the President of the United States. At the end of the day, it stands to reason to me and Thomas Jefferson and many of the other founding fathers that if you were to, for example, create a federal government, then maybe you should have the final say in what it does and does not get to do. It's like if you are a parent, for example, and you leave a list of permissions to your child. You're going to say, hey, here are the things that you can do. Nothing else. Here's the things that you get to do. It's very restrictive. And that child, which you created, was to go outside of those boundaries. Are you going to allow that to happen? No, of course not. In the same way that we, the states, respectively, we, the people, should not be allowing our federal government to operate outside of the permissions that we've given them. We simply nullify it. So Thomas Jefferson wrote extensively about this, the Kentucky-Virginia resolutions. You can read all about it. Again, we have a prior podcast, a prior episode of the show talking in great depth about the Kentucky-Virginia resolutions, Jeffersonian nullification, the alternatives to judicial review. We say no. The states get together and they say no. If the federal government, for example, comes to a decision, whether through Congress, the president, the courts, whatever, and they say that you no longer have the right to petition your government or you no longer have the right to bear arms, as an example, we ignore it. We say no. Missouri, Texas, California, Utah, whatever it is, we say no. We're not going to listen to you. And by the way, this is happening in real time, and liberals everywhere are celebrating it. Nobody's talking about this because it doesn't fit their political agenda, but they threw the supremacy clause, as they claim, as they view it, this falsified, depiction of what it is. They threw it out the window the second it came to marijuana. I mean, marijuana is still a federally prohibited drug, and many, many states have said, no, too bad. We're not going to listen to the federal government. Nullification is alive and well. States' rights are alive and well. I wish that we would apply them to maybe more virtuous causes than marijuana, but either way, what we see is this Jeffersonian alternative. What we see is that despite what the media may claim, despite what they may try and blow up your butt, judges are not supreme. We the people are supreme. The states have an enforcement mechanism called nullification to not listen to them. And the Constitution as written, the black and white, the Constitution, is what is supreme. And this is the reason probably this hasn't been widely accepted, is because it's a heavy responsibility on you and on me, on we the people, to maintain the republic that we have. All right, so now we have, in my opinion, sufficiently unpacked the situation with judicial activism gone wild and the historical context and all of that stuff. By the way, shameless plug, if you're listening this long, I mean, we're now in the fourth and final segment of the show, you obviously like what you're hearing. Be sure that you follow me on all social media platforms. That's X and TikTok and YouTube and Instagram and all of them out there. I greatly appreciate it. Also, continue to do what I know you have been doing. I can see it on the back end. I see the analytics. Continue to share the show. If you're listening on the radio, tell people where to find it. If you're listening and watching on YouTube, tell people where to find it. And if you're listening to the podcast, share it with a friend, a family member. If I have provided you something of value, some good information, and you want to support what I'm doing, that's one of the best ways that you can possibly do it. If you think that it's worth it, all I ask is that you go ahead and do it. So now that we've talked about all of that, I want to segue to Pam Bondi. She's the new Attorney General of the United States, freshly sworn in. You love to see it. I have high hopes for her. Listen, I have learned to become slightly cynical. Maybe I am skeptical. Trust but verify. So when it comes to Pam Bondi, I hope and I sincerely pray that she will be a fantastic Attorney General. And thus far, she has hit the ground running. It was announced today upon recording this episode. You'll see it or hear it a few days later. But upon recording this video today, it was just announced that Pam Bondi has filed charges against the state of New York. She has filed charges against Letitia James. She has filed charges against Governor Hochul and others. She is going after these people. Now, we got to see exactly how this plays out. What exactly is she doing? But she's going after these different people. This is what we need to see. satirically. I have a guy who I have followed on YouTube for many, many years. He's fantastic. This guy's excellent. His name is Wrangler Star. And the first time I found him, it'll all be relevant, trust me. The first time that I found Wrangler Star, he was teaching like how to sharpen a hatchet or something like that, or old school skills that all men used to have, but many of them have, most guys don't know how to properly fell a tree. Most guys don't know how to sharpen a knife. Most guys don't know how to make basic things. And so anyways, he was doing a channel. It's incredibly educational. I would encourage all young men to go and watch some of Wrangler Star's older videos. But I found him doing that kind of content. And then recently I saw him going pretty viral on social media. He has pretty based political takes as well. I like many, not all, but many, many, many. I really, really like Wrangler Star's political takes on a wide variety of issues. He posted a video saying to Donald Trump, he addressed it to him, and it's gone pretty viral now on, at least on TikTok, probably on other platforms, where he said, listen, I'm a pretty darn good carpenter myself, and I would like to volunteer. I would like to offer my services to build the gallows that we're going to need for the trial and conviction of all of the traitors that are in our country. And if you're not familiar, the Constitution lays out the punishment for traitors, for treason. If you are tried and convicted of treason, especially in a time of war, the punishment is you get killed. You get the death penalty for treason. And there are many in our government that have been incredibly treasonous. And so I would love personally, now Wrangler Star puts that out saying, a little bit of satire, obviously, but saying that he would happily lend his services. The American people are sick and tired of treasonous pig dogs in our own government, people we have elected. We have entrusted them to wield power, and they've wielded it against us. Rather than wielding it for the benefit of our people, they've wielded it for foreign masses. And these, it's this whole situation. They're wasting all of our money. We're seeing this with Doge, billions and billions and billions of dollars that we're finding out we're sending it to every moron on the planet except for our own people. God forbid we use American tax dollars for the benefit of Americans. That's such a novel idea, I suppose. But anyways, the American people are so sick and tired of this that you have people like Wrangler Star, who's just a normal guy who likes chopping down trees, and he's now offering his services to build gallows so that we can try these people and convict them of treason. And listen, there has to be some level of punishment. I'm not saying that we go and hang Letitia James or anything insane like that. Nobody get any crazy ideas from what I'm saying here. There's a legal system. I'm advocating for the law. I'm advocating it for it to be enforced as it is written in the United States Constitution. So I'm not saying any vigilante crap. I'm not saying anybody do anything stupid. I'm saying the enforcement of the law against people who have committed crimes against this country. That is what we do need to see. And so already, I bring this all up, obviously, to, weave it back to Pam Bondi, to see that she's already pressing charges. She's going after these people who have gone after us. Make no mistake, it's not that they went after Donald Trump. I've made the mistake of it's not clarifying. When I speak on this issue, maybe not speaking clearly enough. When I say they're going after Trump, he's nothing more than a placeholder for you. He's a placeholder for your daughter, for your son, for your wife, maybe for your husband. He is a placeholder for we, the American people. The reason that they're going after Donald Trump so viciously is because they want to go after you, but he's not letting them. He's standing in the gap between me, you, and the degenerate, evil, demonic people that want to, obviously destroy and subjugate us. And so they are going after him like crazy for the last 8 years. I mean, they've done everything they possibly could. They've spied on him. They've tried to, impeach him. They tried to kill the man. They've done all of these things, try and put him in prison, try and bankrupt him. And now, listen, there's an old saying, and I know Donald Trump isn't a king, so little K when we say this, don't take it too far. But if you swing at the king, you better not miss. And when it came to Donald Trump, they thought that they were going to get the man out of office. They thought that they could impeach him. That didn't work the first time. They tried again. They didn't get it the second time. They thought that they could, bankrupt the man. They thought they could take all of his finances from him. Of course, that didn't work either. They thought that they could put the dude in federal prison for the rest of his life. He was facing like 100 and something, insane amount of time in prison. That didn't work. Obviously, they couldn't smash that through. Even as corrupt as everything has gotten, they still couldn't put him in prison because the American people stepped in and said, no, the man's going to be the president of the United States. You want to send him to prison? We're going to send him to the Oval Office. Screw you. They swung at the king. They tried to kill him. They swung at the king and they missed. because Donald Trump has been put back into office by the American people, and there will be hell to pay. I don't know if these morons thought that they could do all of the stuff that we just talked about, that they could run this, they could try and ruin this man. They could run him through the mud, his family through the mud. They could try and destroy him so hard. And then what? He was going to get back into office and he was going to hold their hand and sing Kumbaya. These people, they're trying to act like, oh, we're all going to be friends now, right, guys? It's like somebody who walks up and stabs you in the gut 15 times, and you pull a gun and stick it out and, put it at their chest or whatever, and suddenly they want to be your friend. Oh, well, let's not go to any rash ideas here. Let's behave civilized. I mean, we wouldn't want anybody to get hurt. I mean, like, brother, you just stabbed me 10 times. Like, yes, of course, there's going to be some sort of a consequence. So I want to be very careful that we don't get lulled into this idea, because this has happened in the past for Republicans. We have been attacked, and this is all metaphorically, obviously, but we've been attacked by a knife-wielding maniac so many times. We get power. Now we're the guy holding the metaphorical knife of power. And all of a sudden, the guy who's been attacking us and trying to kill our families this entire time says, oh, well, let's be friends. You have that. Don't be ridiculous. You don't want to wield that in a bad way. I mean, it would be terrible if you were to give me consequences for what I've done to you. No. When it comes to Donald Trump, I said this last time, I'll say it again. He mentioned that he was going to be our retribution. Well, I'm just going to say it straight up. He's going to get his revenge. Donald Trump is going to get his revenge on the people that have tried to destroy him. And luckily for the country, those people just so happen to be the folks who have not only been trying to destroy Donald Trump, they've been trying to destroy the country that you and I know and love. And they deserve what's coming to them. They do. And so to Pam Bondi, to Donald Trump, to anybody, to Tom Homan, to anybody who is out there, maybe even Tulsi Gabbard, who's going to get justice. Maybe I shouldn't even say revenge. Maybe that's not the right word for it. Because although it is kind of revenge, really at its heart, at its very core, revenge can be a lot of things. Revenge can be bad. This is justice. This isn't tit for tat, evil for evil. This is justice. This is them trying to destroy our country, and them being forced to pay a treasonous consequence. If you're going to behave like a traitor, you should get tried for treason. And there are punishments for treason. Remember what they did to you. This will be my parting words for today's program. Remember what they did to you. Remember what they took from you. Remember when they locked you in your house. Remember when they stole an election before your very eyes. Remember when they told you because of the flu that you couldn't go to your grandmother's funeral, and so your grandma had to die alone in a hospital, scared, confused, and alone. Remember what they have done to you. Remember the way that they have destroyed your Constitution. They've stripped you of your rights, your freedom of speech. The FBI targeted innocent parents. They went after Catholics. They went after so many people. They tried to throw their political opponents into prison. Now that they are no longer in power, now that they no longer wield that power, it can be easy to forget what they've done to you. Do not forget what they've done to you. Remember, as justice is served, remember why it is being served. Remember why people like Pam Bondi are going after them, because, folks, listen to me, they deserve it. They deserve every single ounce of what is coming to them. Again, through the legal processes, according to the Constitution, by the law of the land, they deserve it. That's all I got for you. Till next time, keep me in your prayers, keep your country in your prayers. God bless.